Welcome to Biota Live. I'm Tom Barbalet, and this Biota Live is recorded live on TalkShoe on July 31st, 2009. For more information on the Biota podcast, check out biota.org/podcast. Well, this is an extraordinary recording for a number of reasons, which I will list shortly. But one of the main reasons was that I had planned on actually cancelling tonight's Biota Live. I'm 2 weeks behind with regards to my edits of the last Biota Live with Gerald de Jong, and, work has been rather hectic, and I've had a few other things go on recently, and I thought, well, why should I record Biota Live this evening? However, unfortunately, or maybe even more fortunately, an article which I've had on my hard disk for a number of months now, maybe 2.5 months, for H+ was published this week, and it generated a substantial amount of internet traffic. And I thought, what a pity would it be to lose this momentum by not recording a Biota Live this evening. So I'm rather bleary-eyed, but I am still going to record Biota Live this evening for the hope that we can try a kind of free-form experiment. I've indicated that there's Tolkas from Brisbane who will be calling in shortly, other folks in the chat room who may be interested in participating with this evening's Biota Live. So the topic for this evening may be something along my article in H+, or the Artificial Life Community, an introduction to the Artificial Life Community. It's going to be completely freeform. This is a bit of an experiment with regards to the usually strict formatted Biota Lives that have occurred up until now. But I thought with the H+ article coming out, I should give the opportunity for folks who are discovering the Artificial Life Community and maybe being motivated in thought from the H+ article that they may want to actively participate in this evening's recording. So I'm keeping the lines open, I'm keeping my mic open, and we'll put it all together. It may make an interesting podcast. So some news and notes. Biota.org, the site itself will be moving in the near future. In fact, by mid-August, according to Bruce Damer. The history associated with Biota.org is it's typically been connected with the Contact Consortium's servers, and the Contact Consortium servers are having to divide and separate, and the site has to move. So for me, this has meant a lot of behind-the-scenes work. And what you see on the front of the Biota site isn't really the whole Biota site. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, a lot of articles from the 90s that are still referenced by kind of undergraduate and graduate classes. So there's a lot of traffic under the Biota site. And obviously, I mean, these podcasts have been going on for 4 years now. There's a lot of audio that's been recorded, and quite frankly, it's quite an amazing task. There's about 2.5 gigabytes worth of audio associated with the Biota podcasts, and it means for people discovering the Artificial Life Community for the first time through the H+ article that they have plenty to listen to. This is a very rich community in that regard. I think it's not really possible to get a sense of the Artificial Life Community unless you've gone through quite a bit of the audio, gotten a sense of the kind of discussions. I mean, a lot of them are recursive discussions, a lot of them are, returning discussions, but it gives you a sense of the active participants in the Artificial Life Community and also the diversity of Artificial Life practitioners. And I think really the H+ article was written with the view that I wanted to kind of pick 2 points in a series of probably about a dozen in terms of contrasting the Artificial Life Community to the Singularity Community, because obviously, I mean, recording Biota Live, I think the Artificial Life Community is far richer and has a lot more going for it. I mean, it's an actual applied community where people talk about, real experiments mapping onto philosophy, and it isn't based on some predictive thing in the future. It's very much based on a historical legacy and simulations running in the present. If you're new to the Artificial Life Community, if you're tuning into Biota Live for the first time based on the H+ article, I would implore you to go back and listen to the previous podcasts, because there's a lot of discussion. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about a wide variety of topics, and if you have interests in particular areas, something people have said to me is that they like particular speakers. My wife, for example, is a big fan of Gerald de Jong, and she can listen to Gerald for hours, and I think a number of people who've corresponded with me like Gerald's particular perspective. So as you listen to podcasts, maybe you like Bruce Damer, maybe you like Dick Gordon, maybe you like Jeffrey Ventrella, Gerald de Jong, all these kind of previous participants that have appeared in a relative frequency. They're all people that you can kind of tune into and listen to their particular Biota Lives or previous Biota chats or interviews. And of course, I mean, there are incidental folks who've participated as well, people like Zan Gill and Travis Savo and Mark Badeau, who's the head of the International Society of Artificial Life, and all these kind of people add their own particular perspective. I always like talking with Larry Yeager as well, and he's someone who's been a previous participant too. So it's quite a rich community, quite difficult to distill in this kind of short audio format. However, for folks listening in who are interested in asking questions or getting a sense of the direction of the artificial life community, this is an open, free-form show. Your contributions are just as important as my general rambling, so if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. Another reason that I was thinking of cancelling the show this evening is that I was contacted by a friend at Intel with regards to some work that it's never always on one side of the fence. It's always a little toing and froing with regards to the stuff that I need to develop with Noble Ape that they're going to use. But they have two new technologies that they're interested in, highlighting through Noble Ape. And when this happens, it typically takes quite a bit of time. I remember about 2 or maybe 3 years ago on the podcast that I asked if I could take a couple of weeks off so I could work with Intel, and this work is coming up with me as well. I'm going to spend the first weekend looking at this weekend coming. So that was another reason that I was thinking of cancelling this particular show this evening. And it's an interesting thing because the topic for this evening was going to be artificial life as it's used in industry and science. And obviously with regards to industry, I mean, my own experiences with Apple and Intel using Noble Ape is pretty strong. So that will be ongoing, and I'll talk more about it when I can talk more about it. Unfortunately, these kind of things tend to be a little hush-hush until, when there's some announcement. Although, just doing Google searches, it appears there's quite a bit of information already in the general public about this kind of stuff. It's never really official until it becomes official. That'll take some of my time in the near future associated with the Biota move. So I've talked a little bit about the H+ article, and I have the benefit of a couple of folks in the chat room who are obviously either interested in listening to my voice or have read the H+ article and are interested in contributing questions or some dialogue. And it was something that had been kind of hanging around in my head just for a few months now. I mean, for folks familiar, for early listeners to the Biota podcast, you'll remember that some of these ideas came out in my interview on Shrink Wrap Radio Live, which was actually the origins of Biota Live. December 2007, I think, was when that was recorded. So I've been talking about this kind of stuff for a couple of years now. I think these ideas have been pretty well formed in the artificial life community for that long, and really it's quite striking when you put out an article like the H+ article that really this narrative has kind of continued on within the artificial life community and not really percolated outside of it. I think that one of my great frustrations as a practitioner and active discusser associated with artificial life is that the ideas that go on in these discussions within the artificial life community, the academics, the hobbyists, the folks using artificial life in industry, all these things aren't typically reported on. And certainly I feel part of my responsibility not just to record things like this Biota podcast, but also, reach out into the kind of broader technophile community, and certainly H+ has that readership. The origins of the H+ article specifically related to the Verne Vinci Singularity 101 article that they ran probably about 3 months ago now. It was one of their first articles to kick off the magazine. And that really got me thinking in terms of, well, firstly, why isn't there any artificial life narrative? And certainly when CNN and other large, big mainstream publishers like to do articles on the singularity, I typically do contact the journalists who are responsible for the articles and say, hey, wait, the artificial life community has been doing stuff in this regard, and obviously I have a certain amount of texts and stuff that I can pass on to them and people's names for them to contact. And really the H+ article is the first success with this. My experience with CNN, for example, was that the journalist who wrote the article with regards to the Singularity Conference moved on and ended up working in their Shanghai office. I mean, the speed at which technology and science journalists move through technology and science to other aspects of journalism is always very, very interesting. This evening's show is completely free-form, completely unlike the shows that I've done previously in some regard, although most of Biota Life tends to be a little bit freeform. The topic for this evening is really questions from new folk about the artificial life community, maybe people that have discovered the H+ article and want to just kind of ask questions, get a general sense, and maybe give their own kind of discussion with regards to what they'd like to see in artificial life or what this community has really set off in their own thinking, because it's wonderful to have a group of new folks who are coming to the Biota community specifically for the first time, and I wanted to do an introduction, which is really what this evening's show is all about. So a little bit more background on the H+ article. Obviously, after the appearance on Shrink Wrap Radio, I had that transcribed. As someone who, writes occasionally for various things, I always like to keep a few articles and potential chapters percolating. And when Dick Gordon contacted me about participating in the Divine Action Natural Selection book, I pretty well already had the ideas that came out in the H+ article written. I mean, this is probably early 2008. These ideas have kind of been discussed and percolated through Biota Lives and all these kind of components for, roughly 2 years now. And Dick Gordon's book called Divine Action Natural Selection, a book that put together a group of scientists and a group of creationists and a group of panspermians and even some artificial life developers such as myself together in open dialogue. Folks wrote chapters. I was a dialoguer for 3 or 4 chapters, I think, from memory, maybe even 4 chapters. So I dialogued with a creationist, a panspermian, Dick Gordon, the editor of the book himself, and Bruce Damer. So, 4 chapters. In addition to that, I wrote a chapter called Welcome to the Simulation, which actually went a bit further than the H+ article. The H+ article didn't talk about the power of computation at all. And that is something that I really find quite exciting and fascinating as an artificial life developer. And also this comes through my work with Intel, that, you really get to see the intimate power associated with contemporary processing that certainly the singularity movement completely devalues. I made reference in the H+ article with regards to a philosopher called Nick Bostrom. And he writes about, are we living in a computer simulation? What does this actually mean? And when he writes this stuff, he really doesn't have any intimacy. He doesn't have any knowledge associated with what a computer simulation really is. It's quite surreal as someone who actually writes simulations with these kind of ape-like creatures that wander through an environment, reading Nick Bostrom's stuff. I mean, obviously, he gives speeches and presentations as well in terms of, I guess, probably second only to Kurzweil in the singularity movement. But it always strikes me as surreal. It's a bit like reading a science fiction book which is set in the present. I mean, we have this experience now through, Orwell et al. In terms of science fiction being a relatively historical now genre, that you can read science fiction books about what it would be like to live in, 2009, written in the 50s, 40s, and 30s. And I do really get that impression with regards to the singularity movement. Hello, Tokus.
Hey, how's it going, Tom?
Very good, very good. So, are you a first-time listener, or have you heard previous Biota Lives?
I've joined in chats a few times, but I always get here a bit late. I've listened to all the podcasts, though. It's
terrific.
I found it quite informative.
Great. So you haven't actually come from the H+ article. You have a background legacy of listening to Biota Lives.
Sure. Personally, I'm right into robotics and AI and stuff, and basically, I'm trying to learn all the facets of computer science, and artificial life is, I guess, one of the major facets, and it's a big future of computation and stuff. So,
similarly, the artificial life community has a lot to learn from the robotics community. I mean, in the US and the UK, there are like 2 hobbyist robotics magazines. It's been able to have a whole lot of cottage and even quite, medium-sized company industries that actively supply the robotics hobbyist community. And I think in terms of just public perception, there's a greater degree of connection between the robotics community and the artificial life community, and these are things we can really learn from within the artificial life community.
Sure. Like, myself, I'm coming in from a hobbyist angle, and I want to enter into academia one day, but I'm finding the internet's just such a great tool. You can diversify all your skills and really focus on what you want to learn. And for instance, like you're saying with robotics, it's getting all the research money, and they're getting that advertising on the television because they've got cool robots to show off. So soon there'll be some artificial life that will get the news as well. For instance, EvoGrid as it grows. I think
the science fiction community has done wonderful things for the robotics community as well. And this is something which I've tried to reach out to as well. I know there are a few science fiction authors that plug into the artificial life community. I mean, for example, Geoffrey Ventrella's brother, Michael Ventrella, I think is his name, is a science fiction author, and certainly there's been a historical legacy associated with early artificial life developers reaching out to science fiction authors, but particularly with regards to this idea of hard artificial life, even though that's almost a kind of passé idea. But, Rodney Brooks and the early stuff at MIT, the ideas that, artificial life robots are really where artificial life is engaged currently in terms of a popular perception. I mean, I think there is some kind of crossover. In terms of your own hobbyist robotics, have you thought about combining that with artificial life in some way?
Yeah, definitely. I'm only really, my experience with software is really quite basic, but at the moment, I'm just learning all about the fundamentals of robotics, feedback control, kinematics, all those sorts of things. Once I've developed those skills, I want to include genetic algorithms and even artificial life elements into the robots as for instance, it could be part of their brain. So you could use artificial life to help tune neural networks, for instance.
There are a number of great Vens. And you mentioned that you'd listened to the EvoGrid discussion. I mean, if you've listened to all the Biota Lives, you've listened to the EvoGrid discussion from its very start through to the present day. I mean, what's your own particular view of the EvoGrid?
I'm a big optimist, and I believe that it's a big grand scheme, and it could get all the people from cross disciplines together and do some serious science. And look, I understand. I can't remember who it was commenting on the actual energy usage of such a big project, but I mean, we've already got these massive supercomputers. So if we can get a grid system and use these when they're not being run, let's get it there. There's all these supercomputers in all these universities, and they can jump on. I think that there could be some really interesting discoveries made through the EvoGrid. Could be to do with evolution of prebiotic life, evolution of complex life, a lot of things really. Like it's got the potential to be a major scientific work of this century, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of research money come into it eventually. This is additional news which I haven't actually put out on the podcast yet, but from the discussions, probably the past 2 or 3 Biota Lives, maybe 3 or 4 even, I mean, really when Peter Newman started coming on the podcast, I've been developing my own kind of vision of the EvoGrid in software, and I released it on SourceForge this week, maybe last week now, and I call it chemical automata, and it's this idea that you can generate cellular automata-like forms through using chemical reactions. And I have this model of quantized space where there are 4 different kinds of atomic gases, 2 gaseous compounds and 2 liquid compounds, and the cellular automata, as you'd see in, 2-dimensional cellular automata, except they exist in 3 dimensions, and they also exist in 3 dimensions purely through the chemistry. The rules that would be traditionally written in cellular automata are actually written in the chemical equations. And this is something that I'd put out to Bruce Damer pretty early on, but also particularly talking to Peter Newman as he's started working with ball and stick and then trying to move ball and stick chemical simulation models into quantum mechanics, that really there must be something that's kind of simpler and needs to be distilled in an easier to understand simulation. Ironically, even doing it this way, the computation associated with multiple chemical equations and the kind of non-linear element to these equations operating is quite computationally intensive. So as you say, there is really a need for a movement into the kind of cluster computing and N-core processor community with regards to things like the EvoGrid. Sure. My sense really was that there almost needed to be a competitive element. I mean, I have a lot of respect for what Bruce and Peter Newman are doing, but if we were to have a kind of true open source dialogue associated with the EvoGrid, it's not that there are necessarily competing simulations in the space, but I certainly think there's a kind of fluidity of ideas which isn't actively being represented in Bruce's kind of constant evolution of discussion. Sure. So, I mean, that's my own thinking, but I think also it's an opportunity for the community and for people such as yourself and other folks that are listening in to start doing their own. I mean, as you have a clear vision associated with the EvoGrid, a number of other people have their own particular visions, and it's fascinating. Particularly, I get a lot of correspondence, email correspondence associated with the EvoGrid, when I'm not doing Biota Live, and the fascinating thing is that all the correspondents have their own particular vision. I met Dick Gordon, who's appeared on previous Biota Lives, the embryologist,
came through town probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I met with him and his wife. We went out to lunch. But he has his own particular vision of the Evo grid associated with 4 or 5 decades worth of work that he's done with regards to embryo evolution and all the real-world problems. I mean, he's someone who's X-rayed axolotls, and these kind of things in order to work out how they regrow limbs. I mean, he's very much in the applied fashion. And what I think is interesting, and the Evo grid is really a metaphor for all of artificial life in this regard, is that people hear about the Evo grid, and as you do, they kind of create their own perception of what they want it to be. And you're right, there is almost this kind of utopian or anti-utopian vision associated with the various practitioners. The fellow you referred to was Gerald de Jong. And ironically, I mean, Gerald has had this narrative associated with all the energy that we're wasting developing this artificial life since he heard. I was interviewed on Floss Weekly probably maybe a year and a half ago now, and I mentioned that when Apple first started using Noble Ape, it made their processors run like a hairdryer, basically, the G5 computer, and he has harked on that. So it's a reoccurring theme in Gerald's discussion that what we're really doing is wasting a lot of energy with artificial life. But in terms of, I mean, you've listened to Biota Live. Have you actually downloaded artificial life software and started tinkering with the source code?
I've tinkered with a few things. I've had a look at your software. I haven't got in and played with the builds and or anything like that. I'm just more at the moment. I'm trying to soak up as much information on all the different disciplines associated with computer science and engineering and robotics. So I'm sort of going at one step at a time. But I think when I start dabbling in it, I will understand the processes, and it will be quite enjoyable, I think. Yeah.
In terms of an artificial life developer, what can we actually do better for people such as yourself?
That's a hard question, because I think getting the information out there and basically having a toolkit like a lot of the software I've seen, that you could have the graphical interface is great. But for instance, with reusing the modules, like basically having libraries for genetic algorithms that you could then port into other software easily, that you could then build artificial life programs using these modules would be an interesting thing to have. And that's sort of what I see with the Evo grid maybe, and talking about this XML phenotypes and stuff like that. You could have sort of like a common language that can be shared on different processes. Different programs could then take that information and use it in different ways. So that's one idea.
Certainly. And have you played with Breve or Framsticks at all?
No, I haven't.
I mean, both Breve and Framsticks are used in education, and particularly tertiary education, typically university students. Although I think the things with Breve could almost be used with high school students as well. I'm not sure whether John Klein's done that. But these are tools which, unlike what you're describing, are in fact whole graphical environments where you can, you have an existing suite of libraries, including some genetic algorithm components, and you can create everything from Carl Sims' original blockies to kind of battling robots to two-dimensional cellular automata. And I think it's a kind of learning tool to kind of teach the basics of artificial life, but also give a degree of depth. They do offer something. I'm not sure how I actively maintain Framsticks as currently, but I know, John Klein has had a child recently. In fact, a number of people in the artificial life community are having children, and their artificial life development is slowing down accordingly. But I think you're exactly right. I mean, there needs to be some kind of toolkit associated. In terms of the availability of online information, this has been an occasional topic on Biota Live. Do you feel, have you gotten any of the information from regular physical books, or is all the stuff that you're getting from the internet? Yeah,
there's a few books I've eyed off, but they're all like $100 and something each. So
yeah, that's a real problem.
It is. But what I've found is there's a lot of information out there for people who are doing music with genetic algorithms. And there's a lot of code out there for that, which is interesting.
The music side of things is an area which we've really, I've wanted to get more of it into Biota Live, particularly because, Jeffrey Ventrella does a lot of music-related stuff, and John Klein, a number of these names who we typically talk about non-music related artificial life software with, but they all have artificial life music programs as well and produce quite amazing stuff with that. I think in terms of the visualization, there's something that people really get with artificial life music, particularly because a lot of it combines animations and interaction components similar to, non-music artificial life. But you're right. I mean, in terms of the visualization and the tuning and the sense that people get, it's a very rich environment. And what you're dealing with here is really just a different kind of perception that some people are very, algorithmically oriented. They like to read formulae. Some people like to see visualization, and music just gives a different element to kind of understanding what artificial life is about.
Yeah, definitely. And for instance, with artificial intelligence, a lot of research has been done and built on using music as a basis because it's a great tool. We already have instruments that can connect to a computer, so you run the information in, you've got your parameters, and there you go. So back to the computation things, I've noticed with the power consumption of chips is coming down, and there's actually some really new interesting chips that are coming out which have low power consumption and multiple processors, which is something that artificial life could take advantage of.
Very much so. I mean, I think a lot of that is actually, my own experience of working with Intel, for example, that's what they've used Noble 8 for in terms of both increasing processor power but also decreasing processor consumption, to use a kind of mixed metaphor. The knowledge associated with, as you say, the processes and these kind of things, Gerald de Jong and I and Eric Burton and these kind of folk, when we have this conversation, there are a group of artificial life developers that still enjoy developing in higher-level languages, are not really using the underlying power of the processor. And I'm certainly in the, I want to get down to as close as the silicon as possible in order to exploit the rich computational power. But in terms of the robotics community, the kind of chips that you deal with in the robotics community, how does this kind of compare to the discussions that we have on Biota Live in terms of processing power?
Well, it depends on the task, but in relation to, for instance, the high-end stuff is using networks, most commonly neural type networks, to make the decision processes. So you can train them. And then you still have your logic systems built around that. So the logic systems don't necessarily have to be specialized, but they basically use a lot of specialized chips, like floating point units and stuff like that to calculate. And then they can then build these reduced, reductive models of neural nets, which is basically, from what I understand, is the core of most of the research in robotics at the moment.
I think it's interesting because certainly as artificial life developers, I talk to people like Scott Schaefer, for example, and he develops artificial life very much in the view that these black box components exist in the artificial life community as well. He always talks about kind of dropping, Noble 8 brains into whatever he develops and seeing, what direction that pushes things. And I think it's an interesting discussion because, you talk about genetic algorithms in some regard, but there's a kind of competing movement, and this is interesting when you have Gerald de Jong and me on a podcast together because we kind of represent both ends of the spectrum. I think there are elements of simulated intelligence that you could never get solely from genetic algorithms, and it really is kind of describing it in this kind of black box component element where you do need your low-level systems in some regard, your kind of sensory and obfuscatory systems, and then in addition to this, you may have something that kind of models the central nervous system, and maybe you have your genetic algorithm components, but they all fit together. And I think this is the great metaphor between artificial life and robotics, is that these kind of component element parts are very much part of the artificial life narrative as they are the robotics narrative. In terms of the kind of hobbyist robotics community, what do you think the hobbyist artificial life community can learn from the hobbyist robotics community? Well,
thing I think you could learn as a community could be you could earn extra money by producing your own software. For instance, the iPhone's a great market. With the hobbyist robotics, if people want to make a bit of money, they take their design and they make a kit themselves often. They make their own company, and and that can be like a little side project for them, but they can actually build on that, and it's amazing how that's what this sort of collective share of knowledge that's happening at the moment with the internet, going through the ability to stream video, and people can just share information, large data sets, all these sorts of things. That's all aiding. So with the robotics community, that's basically your best thing is to start a little business and make a product, and that gets it out there.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of discourse in the artificial life community associated with selling things, and particularly the open source movement. And my own sense has been it's very easy to sell atoms, and it's a lot harder to sell electrons, and particularly when the electrons are kind of attached to ideas which seem relatively fragile anyway. I mean, Steve, are you familiar with Steve Grand's work at all?
No, I'm afraid I'm not.
Well, I mean, Steve Grand kind of straddles both the robotics community and also the artificial life community. He wrote the Creatures game in, I guess, the mid-90s, and then they came out with Creatures 2 and Creatures 3, although Steve was less associated with that. But Steve's current passion, and really it's been his passion since he kind of moved himself away from the Creatures development, has been robotics. And, this is what he's worked on for, roughly a decade now, I guess. But Steve's view has always been very much against open source, although he's a solitary developer. He's someone who spends a long period of time kind of in the complete isolation tinkering, and then produces this thing which, in the case of his recent successes, have been books on his robotics work and earlier on his artificial life development. So he very much lives in this kind of closed source reality. There's a lot of the stuff that Steve does that never sees the light of day, and this has always been my frustration, that he'll spend, as he has, a couple of years working on a game, which is a beautifully visualized and conceived game, which then dies. It doesn't see the light of day, it's not published, but also, we get to see a few screenshots and get to hear him kind of wax lyrically about it, but it doesn't exist. And I think the concern with the kind of core practitioners of artificial life, the developers and hobbyists who come on by live on a regular basis, is that the ideas that we develop, go into things like books. I mean, this is certainly something that the artificial life community has done, although, as you've highlighted, we can't seem to get books out there under about $100. In terms of the actual raw ideas, we've been very much caught up in the open source movement, which is all about, in theory, selling your software services for money or some narrative associated with that, although I do all my software services for nothing. I mean, in terms of street cred, in terms of my artificial life development, I work with Apple and Intel, but they don't pay me for that work. It's just something I do as a kind of intellectual pursuit in some regard. So I think the artificial life community, I agree with you. I think the successes in the robotics community, particularly the hobbyist robotics community, are all based in this idea of selling things and creating small companies which then advertise in small magazines, which then get sold on small newsstands, which basically maintain the community. And it's a very beautiful model in the robotics community. The problem with the artificial life community is that we have no atoms yet, in any real sense. I mean, we could start, as you say, creating, components that could go into robots. I mean, that is a possibility. But
definitely.
But our kind of intellectual, our intellectual sphere contains ideas which are probably considerably more leftist in some regard, although really that has no meaning in kind of contemporary society, but certainly considerably more leftist than the robotics community. And I think this idea of the hobbyist within the artificial life community can certainly learn from the hobbyist in the robotics community as well. So as you come into, robotics and artificial life, as you start studying all this kind of stuff, I mean, is your dream to end up creating a small company that develops some aspect of robotics? I mean, is this your hope?
Definitely. I already have my own business. Like, basically, I'm an artist. My main field of study, I've studied ceramics and sculpting, molding, painting, drawing, all these things, bit of 3D animation. But the whole time, I was destined to be an engineer. My goal is to own my own business, where I've got a massive warehouse where we've got all the latest equipment, making whatever we want to do, but it's all with an ethical, positive, obviously, goal, you know.
Certainly.
But that's my dream is to it's almost then I'd have time to be able to merge the art and the robotics together. So you have functional robots that, for instance, if it's in a human interaction situation, it'd look good, it'd talk the right way, for instance, and it would serve a purpose that is meaningful. So there's all these sort of requirements I have for what sort of research I want to get into. But the problem with me is I want to do everything, you know. I want to design robots for all different areas, you know. But again, like you say, you're saying to which side most not necessarily hobbyists, the community as a general, like with robotics, it is a little bit more conservative in a way. But that's, I guess, because they're going for a lot more in the research field. They have to be, you know, a little bit tighter on things. I've almost finished that P.W. Singer book you were talking about a few weeks ago, and it's really quite scary, the level of development of robotics that's going to be going into areas, for instance, such as warfare, which is really the wrong direction. I mean, we're on that slippery slope right at the moment, and the thing is that there is a lot of ethical roboticists out there. It's what I like to think about, and I'm basically an optimist in that way.
Certainly. But it is interesting, this whole notion of closed versus open, and the mentalities that get associated with closed, as well as the, you know, mentalities that get associated with open. I mean, when Dick Gordon was here, and I don't talk about this on Biota Live because, you know, it's typically private conversation or things like that, we went through probably a dozen people in the artificial life community in terms of what they do as their day jobs. Because we never actually talk about what we do as our day jobs, but we all make money doing other things other than artificial life. And the irony is that if you were to pay a number of us what we earn in our day jobs, you could never do it, and you could never do it. I mean, from the money that's coming into even the concepts associated with artificial life currently, although in, you know, pharmaceutical companies and these kind of things, I mean, there is potential, and certainly software development, these kind of things, I mean, there is potential. But this idea of almost closing components of your development in order to sell them or make them commercial products is a very interesting model. And it's something that I wanted to have Steve Grand on to discuss specifically, because he was very successful, as you say. He started out, you know, just in a house, basically being a house husband and tinkering away kind of part-time on his artificial life developments, writing educational software, and then eventually this game. But I think there is potential for that momentum, and the real trick is working out how to kind of be a part of the community, because the historical legacy associated with the artificial life community, there are a number of names who no longer participate in the artificial life community. And the analysis that some of us give is that these were people who were ultimately paid to develop artificial life, and when they stopped getting paid to develop artificial life, they lost an interest in it.
Sure.
And I think the robotics hobbyist community, because, as you say, it starts kind of a small fledgling level, maybe, you know, after hours or these kind of things, and work on the components of a broader robot that people may purchase from. I mean, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that idea. But the real difficulty, I think, particularly associated with the artificial life community in contrast to the robotics community, is I get the sense that there are far fewer practitioners in the artificial life community than there are in the robotics community. And certainly when you look at how it's taught at universities, whilst there are schools of artificial life or departments of artificial life coming out of schools of informatics, robotics is considerably more robust in the kind of engineering communities that come out of academia.
Definitely.
So, I mean, maybe it's a longer-term problem. What's your own thinking with regards to these kind of things?
Just while I've got it in my head, I just had a few responses to back. You're talking about Steve and how he was tinkering away on his own. There's a lot of analogues with that, with a lot of research. For instance, with string theory, there's a lot of mathematicians off working on their own. So, you know, and that goes then back to the open source movement, and then how can you then make money off it? It's all a very complex issue, but I think that you could have a similar sort of thing like with Red Hat or something like that, where you've got people pay money to people like yourself to actually work and keep the code running. So that it's an open source environment, but there are still people making money in and getting paid the right amount.
To give an application with my current interaction with Intel to talk to that, I mean, I think what interests me with regards to my interaction with Intel is probably every 2 years they contact me and they say, we have, one or two new technologies that we want to either use Noble Ape to highlight or integrate in Noble Ape or these kind of things. And typically it's not stuff that I continue on with the Noble Ape development. I have this directory called Contrib, which I put all the contributions from Apple and Intel, but only a very small amount of that actually goes into the practical, running of Noble Ape, so it is always really secondary. The thing that I find fascinating with Intel in particular is, my day job is software engineering. I'm a software engineer, so I know what software engineering is. And they invest probably between 2 and 3 person months of software engineering time into Noble Ape in order to do these things. So I think the problem the method where if they were to hire me, for example, I would have between 2 or 3 months of work every 2 years to do these kind of things. And there is some kind of critical mass associated with the artificial life community. I'm going up to the Bay Area in September to talk about this specifically associated with coaxing people that are doing some aspect of artificial life development in industry. I'm not sure if you remember Ed Salford, but he came on a couple of Biota Lives last year. Ed works at Eli Lilly, and the stuff that they're using artificial life for at Eli Lilly is to optimize their research. Fundamentally, to look at chemical compounds and see whether they're worthy of doing research on prior to the academics and the internals at Lilly ever seeing the chemistry. So rather than what you'd think, using artificial life in pharmaceuticals would be, it's a very specific use of artificial life. However, they're using it at Lilly. And I think there are probably tens of companies out there of a similar size to Lilly that may be using components of artificial life. But we've got to coax them. We've got to get a sense of where they are, what they're doing, and what they need. And no one's really done that analysis yet. It's certainly what I put to Mark Bordeaux when he was on, that the International Society for Artificial Life should start doing that so they can actually have real industry conferences as opposed to academic conferences. In the kind of big picture sense of things, does this make sense to you, and do you have any kind of feedback on that kind of stuff?
Yeah, definitely. Artificial life community's got a lot to add to efficiencies in every form of industry and power generation, networks, all these sorts of things. They can use these, more formally known in as bio-inspired computing in a way. What they talk about with robotics, it's known as bio-inspired. And in that way, you can have your critical systems and have these active agents going around tuning the controls and keeping the system optimized and all that sort of stuff. Taking that, and basically, the thing is, I think there's a similar sort of divide with people who study informatics and then they go off and then they're working for some big company and they sort of can't really be in the hobbyist community because they're working for this big company that they're working on projects that could be confidential or some stuff like that. So there is that divide, and that same divide is in robotics as well.
And as we kind of come to the end of this Biota Live, if people are interested in getting in contact with you, are you active on? Are you on the Biota Conversations mailing list or the EvoGrid mailing list?
Yeah, I'm on the EvoGrid mailing list. My name's actually Luke. Tulkas is like a screen name. But I'm just starting to get a bit more active. I'm hoping that Bruce opens up the wiki sometime so we can start putting in information for the EvoGrid. And also I'll jump onto the Biota wiki and all that. So yeah, I want to get more active in the community, yeah. And
I agree with you completely. I think the EvoGrid wiki, in fact the Biota wiki as well, really need people such as yourself to kind of move it in their own direction. I'm not sure, you probably heard at the intro to this podcast, I was talking about the Biota website because we're in the process of moving it, or at least getting infrastructure ready for a move. And the fascinating thing about the Biota website that most people don't see is the number of Bruce's writings and other, folks in the artificial life and avatar community that have written on pages on the Biota site that are almost impossible to find. The only way that they're still referenced and still being used is because academics 10 years ago started using them to teach undergraduate courses and continue to maintain the links up until the present day. And I think a wiki could actively do that with regards to both the EvoGrid communities but also the Biota community. And I think your background and your interest in the the time you are in your life in terms of formulating your own company and these kind of things. I mean, these are all critical things that the EvoGrid development and the EvoGrid Wiki could really benefit from.
Definitely.
So, Luke, I mean, I'd like to thank you for participating in this impromptu Biota Live. Do you have any questions, any shout-outs, anything you want to leave the community with?
Well, I got an idea for a future podcast where you discuss how artificial life can help virtual worlds and how things like the XML phenotype could be used in a way to describe general information. So, for instance, for simulating a human environment, you could use the same technology. How artificial life can aid virtual worlds development, and also if anyone's interested in starting a Grey Thumb, I'm in Brisbane area. Just get in contact through Grey Thumb website or something like that. There's the international mailing list, and I'm on that for the Grey Thumb.
Certainly. I've been contacted through the week, actually, from people in Canada as well, and the Alberta area, so I probably should send a shout-out to them too. And if folks are interested, I mean, contact me, tom@noble8.com, and certainly, I mean, if you're on the EvoGrid mailing list, Luke, I know how to reach you, and I can put people together. There's an artificial life conference, actually probably going to be the best artificial life conference this year in Australia, ACAL at Monash in December. It's actually, I think it's a bit too expensive. I'm a bit, as you say, I think the books and the conferences, you know, are just way overpriced for a hobbyist community, and this is, you know, why I keep putting Biota Live out to try and send the message out to publishers and conference creators that the prices need to start coming down. I think I heard it was $500, but I could be completely wrong with regards to that. That could be travel that people have added on to the cost of attending the conference. But what's going to happen in Monash is Biota's own Jeffrey Ventrella will be there. I hope Peter Newman will be there, but also a wide variety of academics. There's been a real problem with the artificial life conferences recently because there haven't been many in the US. In fact, there have been next to none. And most of them are now in Europe or this Australian conference, which has really picked up momentum due to the lack of US conferences. ACAL may be an interesting conference for, you know, if people are in the Brisbane area and they plan on travelling down, I mean, maybe you could start up a Grey Thumb to kind of get a road trip down to Melbourne, although 3 days in a vehicle with a bunch of artificial life developers may completely turn you off the whole...
I just look at cheap plane tickets, though. It's not that expensive. I checked out that conference. I think it would be a great conference to go to. I just current timing and funds and all that sort of stuff.
Certainly. But, I mean, the thing about Queensland is, you know, you have, 4 universities that all have either really strong robotics, engineering, computer science schools. I mean, you really are in a perfect epicenter for a Grey Thumb.
Definitely. I think there would be a lot of people that'd be interested. I've got a handful of friends who have got multiple degrees and interested in that sort of thing, so they'd come along. So.
Well, I mean, feel free to start it up just with your group of friends. I mean, this is the history with regards to Grey Thumb in Boston, and if you start it up with a group of friends and start publicising it, I mean, even if it's just a chance to meet in a kind of public space and get together, you will notice that people will turn up. I mean, that's certainly been the case in the Bay Area as well. I mean, start it just with your group of friends in a public space that you announce, and then work from there.
I'll get onto it. It sounds great.
Terrifically. Well, I'd like to thank you for calling in, and I mean, in the future, please do call in. Bruce is going to be travelling for probably the next couple of months, but I do hope to have Steve Grand on shortly, and what I will do is announce when Steve is going to be on through the EvoGrid mailing list as well as the Biota Conversations mailing list, because I think you and Steve could bounce off a lot of ideas, and Steve, you know, in terms of kind of 20 years of artificial life and probably 10, 15 years worth of robotics, would be someone who you'd probably have a great deal of fun talking with. Yeah,
that sounds great. Yeah, I'll check out his research and stuff in the meantime.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to find on Wikipedia and stuff, and he's gone into blogging and all this kind of stuff, so you'll see screenshots of the stuff that he's working on and also wherever he's wandering. He lives about 5 hours from me in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is quite ironic because he received an OBE from the Queen. He's probably the most kind of quintessential, you know, English gentlefolk that you could imagine, yet he lives in Well, he used to live in Louisiana, so he's kind of moving from the deep south through to the Wild West. But a very interesting fellow, and I think you two would have a lot to jam about.
Sure, that sounds great.
So the next podcast on August 14th, Applied Uses of Artificial Life in Science and Industry. That may actually be the one we get Steve Grand on. So I'll try to organise that, and Luke, maybe I'll get you an email and get you back on the podcast specifically to talk to Steve.
Cheers. Thanks heaps, Tom.